All right, happy Monday, everybody, and welcome back to workshop 3 of 4. This time, we are going over the art and science of brainstorming, how to foster convergent and divergent thinking. And again, my name is Liz. I'm the design thinking lead at Innovate Carolina, which is the office for the Vice Chancellor of Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Economic Development. And I'm excited to be here with you all today. So some brief announcements. We're going to start with an overview again, or a review of the Innovate Now Faculty Workshop Series. First, the workshop series hopes to build knowledge and skills in design thinking among a diverse group of faculty, to foster community among faculty across campus who you might not otherwise interact with, and then again to connect faculty with innovation and entrepreneurship experts and resources here at UNC, specifically with our Innovate Carolina team. So at this point, today's workshop again is titled The Art and Science of Brainstorming, How to Foster Convergent and Divergent Thinking. We are explicitly going to discuss the importance of both divergent and convergent thinking and problem solving, provide some concrete strategies for fostering both virtually, and then continue to facilitate individual reflection. Quick announcements. Seems like almost 30 of you filled out that feedback survey, which was really helpful. If you didn't get a chance to fill it out, I know that it closed at 11 this morning. We do need faculty who were also nominated for the Chancellor's Innovation Workshop to make sure that they submit a 2 to 3 sentence bio about yourself by sending it to me via email. So again, if you did not fill out the feedback survey in time for this morning, please make sure that you send me a 2 to 3 sentence bio about yourself at your earliest convenience. Some additional comments, please turn on your video if possible, especially for small group breakout activities. And then for those of you who would prefer to type into chat rather than unmuting yourself to participate, feel free to continue doing that. Wonderful. So at this point, we had a lot of positive feedback about the warm-up activity from last time. So we're going to offer a new warm-up activity for today that you can use with your own teammates or students in your class. And so this one is called Headlines from the Future. So sometimes it's helpful to start at the end. We're going to ask you that to imagine that it's 10 years in the future. One of the projects that you're working on has been resounding success. After some initial challenges, your solution's having a huge impact on the world in ways you'd never imagined. So for the project that you can be thinking of, it can be a teaching-related endeavor, it can be a practice-based endeavor, or a research project. So in the next 2 to 3 minutes, I'm going to ask that each of you draft, either by writing it down or typing it somewhere, a newspaper headline for a New York Times feature of this project and this reality 10 years from now. What does the world look like? How has your project evolved? What's it famous for? Those are some questions that you can think of as you're putting together your newspaper headline. So again, I'm going to put 2 minutes on my clock. If you could each come up with your headline before we push you into small breakout groups. All right, 15 more seconds. All right, so at this point, we're going to transition into some breakout rooms. And in these breakout rooms, we're randomly assigning, so hopefully you'll get to know people that you weren't in the same rooms with last week. And in your small groups, again, as an introduction, please give your first name, the department or school that you're from, and then share your newspaper headline and a brief description of why you're working on this particular project. And each of these groups will probably have 3 to 4 people in them. So we're going to ask you to break out for about 8 minutes. So each participant will have about 1 or 2 minutes to share. Again, name, department, school, and then your headline and why you're working on this particular project. So at this point, I will open rooms. All right, for those of you who are already back, start looking at these warm-up reflection questions as everybody else joins back in, and reflect on how might this activity be helpful as we build and manage teams, engage with users to understand people before problem solving, and to start to create and make choices. So as you rejoin, consider these 3 questions. How might this activity be helpful as we build and manage teams, or engage with users, or start to create and make choices for what to actually test? And in a minute, it would be great if those of you who would prefer to type can type in the group chat your responses to any one of these questions. For those of you who would rather unmute yourself and to offer your reaction to one of these questions, that would be great.
I could start. So one of the things I found challenging when I was writing it initially was just like how high to shoot, like how high to aim for 10 years. And that made me think like, oh, that kind of then traces back to the scope of what you're trying to solve in the first place. And if you did that activity with your team and you found that everybody on your team had a sort of different 10-year vision than you did, that would be telling. So I could see that being a useful exercise just to see what people are thinking.
Yep. Thanks, Kate, for answering that first one. Other thoughts or reactions, either in the group chat or by unmuting yourself?
I really like how it grounds everyone in looking towards the future and in a positive way. So I feel like it's a great exercise to just like, what are we trying to achieve? How do we, what are the things that are going to happen for us to get there? So I really like that for that.
Thanks, Tracy. Maybe one more.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, it does seem like it's a little bit less direct way of also asking people, where do you see yourself in 10 years, right? Because it doesn't probably feel as invasive. You're just saying, like, what are we aiming for? But obviously, it's pretty revealing what people think they want to be producing over the next 10 years, probably.
Yeah, and I see Kate wrote, I like that it forces students to think beyond the semester and even beyond 4 years. So yeah, another way of asking that question without being as explicit. All right, if you want to keep typing, feel free to do that. We're going to get started with the agenda. And so for the rest of the time today, a quick review of design thinking for those of you who might not have had a chance to go back to view workshop 2 yet, an overview of ideation, and then a deeper dive into specific virtual, divergent, and convergent thinking methods that you can begin to use, and then ending with Q&A and some announcements. So again, a review of design thinking. What is it? For the workshop, we are using IDEO's version of design thinking, and so they define design thinking as a human-centered approach to problem solving and innovation. And again, I'm putting up this graphic that shows that design thinking is explicitly designed so that we can think through these three really important buckets: the desirability, feasibility, and viability of potential solutions, and aiming for that sweet spot in the middle where we find overlap between all three of those different buckets. Design thinking is a set of mindsets. It's also a methodology and a process that's repeatable, in addition to a set of tools. And again, the ice cream is here to remind us that there's different flavors or versions of design thinking out there. In essence, though, they're all very similar. And again, we're focusing on IDEO's version. For those of you who want a refresher on the mindsets, there are 7 that IDEO embraces. And so creative confidence, creativity is something that can be taught and practiced over time. Emphasis on making things instead of just theorizing. 3, the growth mindset, learning from failure constantly. 4, empathize, so making sure that we're spending time getting to know our users and their wants and needs before we actually tackle problems. 5, embrace ambiguity, know that things will be ambiguous and it's fine. 6, like Tracy said earlier, things are framed in an inherently optimistic way, like that beginning at warm-up activity. And so we assume that there are solutions out there. And then 7, iterate, 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 again, learning and actually testing things with real people before we put all of our eggs in one basket. So the high-level view of this process, again, very pretty and linear in this picture, starting with inspiration, which was the focus of last week's second workshop. So how do we, before we start diving into solutions and solving problems, go back and do more homework so that we really understand the people that we're trying to design with and for, as well as their contexts and challenges. Followed by today's focus, which is ideation. How do we take what we've learned in the first phase and actually start to brainstorm and make choices about what we create? And then the last phase, now that we have some of these ideas, how do we test them and collect data in real time so we know which of them are more promising, more viable, more feasible, so that we can choose where to invest. And then there are tools. And for the pre-work for today's session, we did ask you all to familiarize yourself with some of the resources online that IDEO offers for free. And so they have beautiful web pages that feature the different methods that they have and give instructions. And so as we go through the workshop today and on Wednesday, we'll continue to reference different methods that they use and then encourage you to figure out which of these might apply to the work that you do. And then this last slide with this graphic, design thinking versus traditional problem solving, especially with last Wednesday's focus on inspiration. We know that many of us like to be handed problems or take the problems that are presented to us and then starting there, move forward to a solution. Design thinking really explicitly challenges us to pause once we've gotten some information about the problem and then go backwards to do a lot of empathy, understanding, inspiration work to learn more about the people, problem, context so that we can unearth new problems to then drive towards new solutions. Great. So at this point, we are now at the ideation overview. So again, focusing today on that second phase presented by IDEO. Wanted to put a plug here that IDEO does offer IDEO resources. So there are courses, online courses, you can pay for that go in depth into a variety of different topics, including what we're covering today, which is convergent and divergent thinking. And so if you have any questions about those courses or want some recommendations, feel free to email me as well. Okay, so for the ideation overview, divergent and convergent thinking. IDEO likes to think about divergent thinking as creating choices, and that is separate from convergent thinking, which is then making choices. And many of us have been in meetings and been asked to brainstorm and come to consensus, and those processes often don't separate these two processes. And then sometimes we also don't have transparency about what those processes actually are. And so it's important for us to tease that apart today. With regards to divergent thinking, the purpose of this is to explore different directions and expand options, to try new things and to take risks. It's time to think about what's possible instead of only what's feasible. And so recommended environment, and we're talking about environment both physically and virtually, but space or time, virtual whiteboards, virtual sticky notes, things to write, constraints, again, time, so making sure that there's an end point to your divergent thinking, so you're not brainstorming forever, and then also a well-framed challenge question, what we shorthand as how might we's. So a little bit more info here about how might we's, and again, this is something that we could spend an entire hour and a half session on, but the quick and dirty version of it is that we would take the insights generated from the inspiration activities up front and then frame them as a question with how might we at the beginning of the sentence. And so after we do that, maybe with a couple of different insights, you generate a few different questions, decide if the questions are too broad or too narrow. And oftentimes if it's too narrow, it's because we've prescribed a solution in the question itself, which is very limiting. And then we ask that you test by brainstorming ideas yourself using those questions and then adjust if needed. And so for a quick example from the grant that I was on where we were working on that sex ed project, Innovation Next was the accelerator, and they specifically asked us to apply as teams of 3 to use technology in some way to improve teen pregnancy. So very broad. Again, the overall arching goal of this accelerator was for people to use technology to improve teen pregnancy. And from the inspiration work that I presented last week, one insight from those inspiration activities was that teens didn't want to learn about sex ed in schools. And so we took that and then tried to write some questions using the words how might we up front. And some questions that we generated included, how might we provide sex education content to teens outside of school settings? We figured that that was actually going to be a little too broad. How might we provide sex education content via smartphone apps to teens outside of school settings? Too narrow. You can see here that we've prescribed the solution here by adding via smartphone apps. And so we ended up with how might we use technology to provide sex education content to teens ages 13 to 15 outside of school settings. So specifying that we wanted to use some form of technology because that was a requirement of the grant mechanism, and then limiting our scope to teens ages 13 to 15 instead of all teens. And so again, this is an activity that you would do by yourself, maybe with teams, after you've gone through the inspiration activities. So with regards to how you would do divergent thinking with a team in a meeting, we recommend doing some sort of warm-up activity like we did today that gets the creative juices flowing, providing very clear constraints and instructions like a how might we question, and then providing individual brainstorming time before you ask groups to share or people to share in groups, and then culminating with some sort of synthesis. And with that choreography comes some common tensions. And so some people might be more comfortable than others with this type of thinking and this type of process. So you will have early convergers, so folks who immediately gravitate towards a few ideas even at the beginning of brainstorming and stay there. And so it'll be important for us to encourage them to not only consider their ideas that they really want to put forth, but then to widen it to others. Judgment, we all self-judge the ideas that we're coming up with in a brainstorm, and so to encourage folks to do that as less as possible, knowing that more ideas will generate more discussion, and you can then talk about what is helpful and not helpful about some of these ideas. And then lastly, safe ideas. So folks might tend to put forth ideas that they've already heard or already in practice just because they might know that they work in some way, and are, again, judging themselves and not allowing themselves to really push for creativity. And so we have some ways to mitigate some of these common tensions. Before we get there, we're going to talk about convergent thinking. And so while divergent thinking is about creating choices, convergent thinking is a creative process that requires us to understand the essence of our ideas so that we can keep the most promising elements in play by making choices. So again, the things that you would want to be able to see all of the options displayed, a way to gather all of those options if you are going to be virtual, and then some sort of voting process and potentially tools. So whether that's going to be in person with stickers or poster chips, or virtually, you might want to assign people an emoji that's theirs so that you can be able to indicate ideas that you support. Constraints. This is important. Selection criteria for evaluating ideas. Many of us will get to a brainstorm and have to come to consensus at the end of a meeting, but it hasn't been articulated what criteria we will each use to select those ideas. And options might include desirability, feasibility, and viability. Those are at the core of design thinking. Or if you want to think about feasibility, for instance, you could use a now, near, or far selection criteria, up to you and your team. In terms of how you would do this in a meeting, first start by discussing the selection criteria and converging around that. And then discuss the ideas, making sure you can see all of them, ending up with some vote or way that you can make a decision. Here, common tensions include groupthink. And so it's possible that what people are saying sway your perspective, and whatever, either in a good way or in a not so helpful way, it's possible that just the hive mind works. Two, with regards to timing, some people, if you haven't explicitly said we've exited the divergent thinking and entered the convergent thinking space, might be still in the phase where they're offering new ideas, and it's not really helpful if you've explicitly moved into convergent thinking that people keep offering new ideas to be considered. And so one way to mitigate that would be to have an explicit or virtual parking lot. So if you have folks who are continuing to generate ideas, make sure they know that they're being heard and those ideas are being captured, but we've transitioned to a convergent thinking space and time. And then bias convergence. And so for those of you who have bosses who initiate brainstorming and your boss offers ideas at the front end and you know which ideas they've offered and why, it might be difficult for you to vote for something that was not endorsed by your boss. And so some strategies for mitigating that would be using technology like we have been, like the Jamboard that anonymizes the actual ideas. And then once you get to some sort of voting, instead of saying, oh, this is Anne's idea or this is Melissa's idea, referencing here's idea one. And so distancing who might have generated the idea from the discussion of it. And this was a quick blitz, but overall recommendations: allocate separate times for divergent thinking and convergent thinking. They're different processes. Next, use consistent rules and processes. So creativity, again, is something you practice over time. And so if you have rules and processes that are known and expected, your team will get more and more familiar with them if you use them consistently. And then last one, to drive home, for divergent thinking, make sure you give people time to brainstorm individually before asking them to either brainstorm as a group or share in a group. So at this point, I've presented a lot of information. It would be great if you all could spend 8 to 10 minutes in the next little bit reflecting on the following questions. So for yourself, self-determine, are you more comfortable with divergent or convergent thinking and why? Second, how might you change the way you brainstorm in the future to have a more intentional process? And then lastly, what additional questions do you have at this point about divergent and convergent thinking? And it would be great if those of you who have questions could type them into the chat so that as we go through the rest of today with examples and activities, we can make sure that we answer them. So again, I'm going to push you back out to the same breakout rooms that you were in at the beginning. You all will have 10 minutes, and I want you to answer these 3 questions and then generate some additional questions to share in the chat as you all come back. So at this point, I am going to go back and push you back out to breakout rooms, and we will see you in 10 minutes. Ryan, I'm going to assign you to a room.
That's me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. We're going to regroup, pull group, and then see what additional questions have come up, and then move forward with practicing some of these different methods.
Okay. Hi, Eric.
All right, so for those of you who are returning, if your group came up with some questions that you'd like us to answer, feel free to start typing them into the chat. We are going to prioritize moving forward and practicing some of these methods and processes with virtual technology, and so might need to save more of these questions for later. But again, for those of you who are just joining, if your team breakout group had questions that they wanted to ask, feel free to type them into the chat as we move forward so that we can answer them towards the end of today's session. You're going to prioritize doing. Okay, so virtual design thinking methods. Brainstorming. All of us have done this. We've all said this word before. And we're going to encourage that folks start to use a more explicit process with brainstorming rules in place to really encourage the environment and type of ideas that we're looking for. And so I've copied and pasted an image of brainstorming rules that IDEO offers. And so the first, deferring judgment, so of yourself and your ideas and of others' ideas, explicitly encourage wild ideas, build on the ideas of others, stay focused on topic as you're sharing one conversation at a time. The next one, be visual. And then the last, go for quantity. Typically, when I work with adults, the ones that they struggle with the most are the last 2. So being visual and going for quantity. So being visual, sometimes, especially if we're asking for folks to envision or brainstorm aspects of processes, it's just faster to draw an image than to write it all out in limited time. Yet so many people will sit there and say, oh, like I'm not a good drawer. But remember, at this point in brainstorming and divergent thinking, we're not looking for whether this is beautiful and outward facing. We're just trying to get the gist of the idea. So try to be visual whenever you can. And then the last one, the going for quantity. We are trying to get as many ideas onto the table as possible, because from that many ideas, we can then start to have more conversations about what we like and don't like about the ideas put forth. If we're only putting ideas forth that we think are good, and therefore only like 2 or 3 ideas at a time, it's really hard for us to draw conclusions about what types of ideas might work or might be more feasible if you are only limiting yourself. And so the trick here also is to make sure that as you all are brainstorming, either in person or virtually, to encourage that you have one idea per sticky note, and you'll see later in some of the activities why that's really helpful, but one idea per sticky note so that later it's easy to move them around and group them. So at this point, we're going to transition to an activity using the Google Jamboard again. And so you're going to spend 3 minutes individually brainstorming all the ways you can imagine using a shoelace. And I'm going to copy and paste the link for the Google Jamboard into the chat window. And I know that there's a limit to the number of people that can access the Jamboard at one time. It's somewhere between 25 and more. And so if you aren't able to access the Jamboard, just type your ideas into chat. So at this point, I just sent the link for the Google Jamboard, hopefully with editing privileges. So each of you should be able to get there. And again, we're going to individually spend 3 minutes getting to the actual, or brainstorming all the different ways you could be using a shoelace.
Are we supposed to start putting them into the notes or wait for 3 minutes before we start putting them in notes?
It would be great if you could do it now because you are anonymized at this point. And so feel free to do it. And I will start sharing my screen as soon as I can pull the Jamboard up myself. One more minute. All right, 10 more seconds. And time. All right, I'm gonna give folks a minute just to skim through the post-its here. Okay, at this point, it would be great to hear from one or two folks about how brainstorming went with the set of rules. And so reactions to brainstorming with the set of rules that I've tried to uncover in this screen.
It worked, but I still felt like maybe it was just a question, but I ran out of an idea quickly, like, because I didn't have time to think ahead of time. So I realized I'm one of those who needs to brainstorm early before I come to the group. So I felt like I stopped quick.
Yeah, Leslie, thanks for offering that. And I saw that there were questions also about how to engage introverts more in brainstorming. And so, like you were mentioning, really helpful to give people prep time. So whether it's sending out the agenda with the brainstorming questions ahead of time so that people can brainstorm before they come into work for that meeting, or asking people before generating it on this board all at once to have individual time is helpful. And then also encouraging folks, if you finish your ideas, you can always start to look at others and then build on the ideas of others. And so maybe you spend 2 minutes brainstorming and then you spend that last minute explicitly looking at what other people have written to add to them. Great. All right, one or two other reflections, like how did it go with the brainstorming rules?
So this is Todd. I liked it a lot. I naturally kind of think pretty quickly and come up with like off the cuff ideas. And so honestly, I kind of felt like it was a game. And I was like, how many ideas can I come up with? And then I saw myself like looking at some of these and I was like, oh, that's funny. I never thought about that. And I noticed that I misread one. Like we have tie off an umbilical cord, but when I glanced at it the first time, I was like, oh, umbilical cord. Huh. And I don't know, like I kind of chuckled a little bit, but I found it really amusing and a little bit gamified, which, you know, it works for me, but I know my experience with students, some people don't really like it because they feel a little rushed or whatnot. But your point about building off other people's ideas, like that kind of got to me. And I noticed myself, I would glance up occasionally and kind of do that too. So it really did resonate with me, but I think I think my personality is well suited for this type of work.
Yeah, I was gonna say I do some similar things in my class, and students struggle when I give them like the serious topic, and I'm like, you have to come up with 51 ideas to solve this very serious real world problem. But then I have them do this with like a goofy one, which is like, how would you catch Sasquatch? Or no, how would you catch Nessie? And then the kids get really, like, they really have a good time with that, and they come up with things that are totally off the wall, and it always goes much better because they have to get to 100 ideas on that one. And so I tried to think about this one with like being less serious, and that made it easier.
Perfect. And Kate and Todd, your comments segue really well into the like other ways you can incorporate brainstorming slide. And so as a warm-up, so you can use Kate's Sasquatch idea or this shoelace idea first so that people can just get used to the rules and the technology before you actually ask them to do it for real with the problem at hand. And so some other creative bursts that you might want to try would be draw a team mascot, brainstorm some gross things, and then you can choose one at random to turn into a beautiful trendy product, all in like 15 minutes or less. Making lemonade, so you give them a scenario and ask them how to make it a positive thing, like all phones in the world have been shut off, and ask folks to come up with why that might be really great for civilization. And then there are also variations that you can use during your divergent thinking or before and after you do whatever it is that you are focused on the topic at hand, is the bad idea brainstorm. And so explicitly asking people to come up with ideas that they would deem as bad. And it's really helpful to generate conversation about why there's a common thread about some of these ideas that's bad that can then later inform future brainstorms or your selection criteria. And then switching hats. So you could ask people to specifically brainstorm ideas from the perspective of fill in the blank. So if we were working on things related to COVID response and preparing our university campus for reopening. You could ask folks to take the perspective of a student or a staff member or a faculty member in different rounds. Make it personal. So this is another activity that I really like to start generating discussion in a way that you might not otherwise think about. And so you could imagine your product, service, or intervention as a person, and then think about what its name might be. This could be a real person or not. What are their hobbies? What are their personality quirks? And then encourage folks to actually use a Jamboard or some other supportive technology to show you what they think your product, service, or intervention would be as a person. And then conversations like these can get at the essence or key components or key descriptors that you would want clients or patients to be using to describe your thing. And so it's a different way to understand how you want people to feel and describe your product. A co-creation session. So this is something that I use a lot with working with teens. The people that you're designing for or with can show you what they want. So you can ask them a question and provide the materials for them to create. And then after they've done the creating, you can encourage them to share more or to probe on why they've drawn the things that they've drawn. And again, you can do this with the Jamboard. And so for the work that I was doing with teens, we heard time and time again that they really wanted something that they could go to at the same place on their phone. And so most consistently, they wanted a phone app. And once we landed there, we asked some questions, gave them blank screens and some markers, and asked young people to draw what they wanted a sex ed app to look like. And then after they were done drawing, we actually went a step further and asked them to pitch their ideas to other teens in the room and paid a lot of attention to the language they were using to describe their apps. And this is actually where some of our marketing materials came from, this activity. We heard from teens that they were all emphasizing that they wanted a safe space where young people could be, and they wanted to make sure that others knew that they weren't going to be alone in growing up and going through puberty. And so that messaging about a safe space and making sure that others feel like they're not alone came from activities like this, in addition to generating ideas for features. Okay, and then we're getting to journey mapping, which I love. And so our journey map allows you to identify and strategize for key moments in the product experience or service you're designing. So it helps you visualize the user experience. Many of us spend a lot of time thinking about the product itself. What does it do? What does it look like? Just everything related to the intervention, product, or service. And many of us don't spend enough time thinking about, in the real world, how will we expect real people to stumble across our product, service, intervention, and how will they decide whether they want to use it, to buy it or not? And then after they use it a couple times, what do we expect their experience looks like? And so I'm going to now return us to the Google Jamboard to see a very brief example that I put together. So in the second Jamboard, let's pretend, based on my case study, that we're creating a new app for teens. We could ask each team member to create a journey map and then discuss it all together. And so in this particular journey map, I've marked 2 axes. And so at the bottom, I have time/phase. Along the left, I was really interested in charting teens' excitement levels. And then in pink, I was thinking through all the different points in time where there would be different phases or behaviors or activities that would be expected of the teen user. So in pink, I have, well, at some point I need the user to discover the product. They're probably going to test or vet it before they commit to either buying it or downloading it. And then they're going to use it a couple times. And then they're going to make a decision about whether they want to keep using it and potentially recommend it to other people, or whether they're not going to keep using it. And so after I went through and put those phases in Post-it notes where I generally thought they were and marked where I thought their excitement level would be, so hopefully they would increase in excitement as they discovered the product, tested it, and then committed to it. And then it might be the same or dwindle depending on their experience. And then I went back in blue and started to think through and brainstorm some ideas about how might they discover this particular product, Instagram ad, a teacher referral. And for those different ideas, I also ranked excitement. So I thought that they would be more excited if they discovered it via Instagram ad or a friend texted to them versus a teacher referral. But again, I spent only a couple minutes putting this together, and it does show from a user perspective different time and decision points, and then gives you space to start thinking about some ideas here. And again, it would be really great if you could do this with the team and then come back together to understand what key points are important to chart for a particular user, and then the ideas that you've generated. Okay, so knowing that many of us hope to change human behavior in some way with our work, even the simplest behaviors can be distilled down into different processes and decisions. So now it is your turn to go ahead and try this on your own. And so as a group, I'm going to ask you to find the Google Jamboard that matches the group number that you're assigned when you get pushed to breakouts, and spend 8 minutes putting together a journey map for how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So I know that all Jamboards will look different. Try to document the process and decision points. And I wrote bonus points for documenting a feeling if you could track that over time. And so again, at this point, each of you will be able to go back to that same Jamboard. In the subsequent Jamboards, they are numbered. And so as you get pushed to your breakout group in a minute, just pay attention to what group number you are so that you can go to that Jamboard. And so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and set the timer for 8 minutes and then push you back out to breakout rooms so that you can create your peanut butter and jelly sandwich making journey map. And again, all of you will have different maps, and that's totally fine. We will come back and talk about your experiences in 8 minutes.
Yeah, good. An interesting way they've done theirs. Journey map.
This team is always so good at coming back very promptly, and then I'm not sure why others lag so much, but I appreciate this team for being very prompt. All right, we will not have time to go board by board to see in detail what every group came up with, but again, wanted to emphasize that this is a great activity to do individually and then bring everyone together to walk each other through their boards so that you can see everything that went on. And so I'm just going to flip through the different boards quickly so that you can just see how different people chose to do this activity. All right. So at this point, there are a couple questions that came up in the chat that I want to answer before we go into convergent thinking very quickly. In the questions about how do we, or what is the ideal size for going through and actually going and doing these types of activities, it depends on your decision-making body. And so if your typical group size is like 3 to 4 people, totally fine to do it with 3 to 4 people. If you do have a larger group though, activities like the ones that we went through, especially the brainstorming, can be very well facilitated, especially if people have a heads up as to what they're brainstorming and you're adhering to rules and you're using the consistent process over time. And so I have been able to do this well with groups of people, even 75 to 100, using technology like Poll Everywhere. So that's another great option that you can use to capture a lot of different ideas, and then you can capitalize on some of the other features for convergent thinking, like upvoting or ranking. And so we can talk more about that if you have questions. And then length of time, it depends. For brainstorming in particular, again, I think it's more important to make sure you have time for individual brainstorming before you go into group brainstorming. But individual brainstorming might only take 3 to 5 minutes. And then again, group brainstorming can start at 5 to 10 minutes of sharing and adding ideas before you explicitly move into something else. And you can do divergent and convergent thinking in the same meeting if that's what you want, but you could also separate it into today, tomorrow, this week, next week, depending on how your team operates best. And then in terms of virtual convergent thinking methods, just to give a couple options. The first step that you can do after you've done some sort of brainstorming or journey boarding, journey mapping, or any of the activities we just went through is to look at the ideas that you've generated and to group things together that have some sort of similarity to them. And so this is also why we encourage you to use one idea per post-it, because then it's easier for you to either in person move post-it notes or virtually to click and drag things that should go together. And so group things together that make sense, and then go through the process of actually naming the groups or clusters, so indicating why they're similar. And these themes might help you actually refine your decision-making criteria. And so if you see from the brainstorming, it didn't come out in your inspiration phase, but there's a lot of ideas about a certain activity, you might want to then go back, and if that's important to your team, to the project, for you to actually make that an explicit criteria for selection, asking yourselves along the way, have any patterns emerged? What surprises you? What feels significant, as a first attempt to make some sense and to synthesize what you just saw. And then another activity that I like doing as a group, but you could also give everybody the same board of options to go through and then do this individually before coming back, is to have people go through and after a brainstorm to review all the ideas and come up with their top 5, and not to explain or over stress criteria at this point. And from there, after everybody is given their top 3 or top 5, engage in a discussion to surface what might become decision criteria or priorities for this brainstorm or for future brainstorms. So again, taking what you've learned from inspiration and earlier divergent thinking methods and activities to then inform what decision criteria you ultimately end up with to make decisions. And at this point, we have come to announcements and reminders after today's preview of this content. And so first, our next workshop is going to be on Wednesday. It's the 4th workshop of 4, testing and prototyping your ideas without being in person. So how might we go through and get real feedback from potential patients, users, customers, while we're not in person with them? before Wednesday, we do ask that each of you identify, similar to the pre-work for today, some ideation activities from the design kit posted to Sakai that you plan to implement or try in your own work. You will be emailed a feedback survey after the workshop today. And last call for signing up for office hours with Innovate Carolina experts this week. We will offer them through Friday. And so at this point, I will transition to questions. And so I will go back to the chat and see if there are any new ones that have been added. And if not, or in addition to that, feel free to also unmute yourself to ask as well. I got a question about for like logistics and actually executing this. Is it better to have one person be the one who's writing versus each of you going through and posting your own separate answers? And so I would say that it's more helpful if you can do it individually, so you are each typing your ideas up, and just so that you can control your own cadence, especially if you are a slower or faster processor, especially in the individual brainstorm phase. It would be helpful if you each type. I think once you get to a point where you are supposed to be doing a group share, it's again up to the team whether they want to designate somebody for efficiency's sake to be the typer and everybody participates, or if you want to go through and have people contribute individually. But there's, again, pros and cons to both approaches.
Liz, this is Leslie.
Yes.
One of the things that I noticed from today's, and it just could be because we had a real cool group, but is it was a really great icebreaker to do kind of such a silly thing on the peanut butter sandwich. But it also really helped identify how each of the different members of the team worked and how we thought. I think it was a great way to illustrate that. So it could be a real growth thing for a new team.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. I do think that a lot of these activities might challenge you to reflect on the way that you operate as an individual and operate as a team. So I do recommend that if you have the opportunity to plan onboarding events for new teams, for you to include some of these activities and then explicitly discuss where people felt tension, how you can better support them if you were to repeat this activity moving forward, or how they might change the process. So I do think that you're right, this is a great reflection and professional development tool in and of itself, and hopefully you all could also apply it to project work too. Any other questions in the next 2 minutes? I can stay on to answer one-on-one questions again, but for those whole group questions, are there any others? All right, I will stay on for a few minutes. If not, I think that, again, the big takeaways are convergent and divergent thinking are different processes and should be separated. It could happen in the same span of time, but really draw the distinctions for team members so that they understand the intentionality behind the way you run meetings. And then for those of us, we all know that we all have different processing speeds. So whenever possible, give people time before any whole group activity for either divergent or convergent thinking to do thinking on their own. So with that, I will thank you all for your attention today. You will get an email from me with next steps this afternoon, and then I will see you for our final workshop on Wednesday.
Thanks, Liz.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Liz.